I'm going to be using OpenAI's GPT-5.3 Codex to do a slightly more complex code review. This is going to be very tricky because it is a reusable library that I've packaged into a NuGet package. Specifically, this is going to be for data access, typically using the well-known design patterns unit of work and repository pattern.
So conceptually, the process of hooking up the code to a database will be effectively the same for almost any application. Typically, there's only one DbContext, which is concrete and known by compile time, and now this is going to be easily mapped to a database. Most applications simply apply this abstract concepts or the design patterns by doing some sort of non-obvious or non-intentional copy and paste for each application. But if a developer was to take a step back, you're going to realize that conceptually the same boilerplate code or the steps are being used to build out the data access layer. Same conceptual structure, effectively just pointing to a different connection string. Basically, if you're using Entity Framework, you are always going to have a DbContext. Then if you are also trying to have good coding practices, you're also going to try and place the queries in a generic repository of T. Then you can take this a step further where some other developers will have their unit of work that only commits once everything else has been done. And then you can also take this best practices a little bit of a step further by having a command query segregation pattern. Like I've said, the steps are exactly the same, and the main work or the main trick is to be able to instantiate a concrete DbContext. So that's where maybe the difficulty would be. So if this is the case, why not just place most of this boilerplate steps in a library or NuGet package? Then for the application that's going to use this library or package, it has to somehow figure out a way to create a concrete DbContext. And this is exactly the goal of this reusable library that I've just written. It uses a fluent API syntax for data access. For example, let's say you have an entity. To use any method that performs a query, you can simply just say data access .queries, and then you can specify the method, for example, get all. And then for commands, we can just say data accessor.commands.add. And then much later on, when you want to commit all the DB changes, you can simply just call the commit method. Now, the challenge for GPT-5.3 Codex is beyond just going just a simple code syntax review. Instead, where things might get tricky for this model is that it has to be able to understand the intent and the reason behind the architecture. I expect GPT-5.3 Codex to already know a lot about the generic repository, to know about the unit of work, but this library is my own opinionated implementation of a data access. And the target or the goal in this exercise or this challenge is that 5.3 Codex has to be a lot smarter than just simply trying to infer or reference the vanilla design patterns. It's also going to have to know about the other related topics such as specification pattern. So it's very unlikely that AI would have seen this sort of configuration that I have here in most of its training data. So this is more of a test of how smart or intelligent beyond just repeating what it would have seen in training if you give it a very hard a specific or specialized architecture. Okay, so now let's get the review started. I'm going to be using VS Code to interact with the AI. I have created an instructions file instead of manually typing the prompts. The instructions are pretty much what I've just discussed. Now, for the review, the score of this NuGet package or library is simply 46 out of 100, which is quite clearly a fail. And without having to read through this whole review, in summary, the main issue is around how the DbContext lifecycle is being managed. So, just as a reminder, again, as to what I'm trying to achieve here, this is inherently a complex, unusual configuration that I have. I'm simply trying to get reusable data access across many applications. So, the difficulty is that by compile time, the DbContext is unknown, and the consuming application must provide a concrete instance. This is going to be a similar concept to having an abstract class that only becomes useful when there's a concrete implementation. So the tricky part for AI is to reason outside of the code and understand the trade-off between having something that's reusable and me having to have this concrete repository, but then it's just a copy and paste. GPT-5.3 Codex could not reason to understand why reflection is being used. So it's actually flagged this use of reflection as an issue. So another problem, if we go to point 7 in this review, is my design is using a hybrid ID. So I'm using both the generic database generated sequential ID, and then instead of naming this field just ID, I find just saying ID is going to be a little bit ambiguous. So I've decided to name it DbID. Now this DbID is generic for all the entities and is going to be auto-generated by the database. There's also now a second ID, which is going to be a GUID, and this is generated by the specific application. So the application does not need to wait for the DB round trip to have that integer ID generated. Now Codex 5.3 doesn't appear to understand the concept of this hybrid ID. Okay, so now overall, what is my comment on this code review that GPT 5.3 Codex is given? I mean, to be fair, this was a very tricky challenge. This review was not so much about the actual code, but more about taking a step back and looking at the whole architecture. AI model had to understand why some decisions were taken. GPT 5.3 Codex is not able to see the bigger picture. I would say this is going to be the same for any model. So it's not a Codex 5.3 problem. I just think that having seen other models of this generation, there's still a long way to go before they can be a little bit more almost like human smart. And if this was only just a code review, I would give this 8 out of 10. But because any AI model would also miss the reasons behind why this reusable library is useful, I would rate this very hard challenge. I'm going to give it a score 3 out of 10.